We are on Zoom because we are in the middle of a pandemic. We've all had lots of experience with this over the last 6 months. And Randy has mentioned the whole recent history of polio around the world. And as an epidemic or a pandemic, really polio it's not the worst. It's not the most contagious. It's not the most deadliest. It's been around for a long time. But I think with polio in the US, it was the fear that really drove the concern about polio through much of the 20th century. And really, it's a relatively new disease for the US. It only first appeared in the US in 1894 and left in 1979. So it had less than a 100-year lifespan in the United States. But there was so much unknown, just like with our current pandemic, our COVID-19, people didn't know how it spread. They didn't know why it was more prevalent in the summer. They didn't know why it attacked certain muscles and not others. And a lot of that knowledge, it's that fear, that drives a lot of it's fear, it's concern. So I'm going to share some quotes from a woman we interviewed about 10 years ago. Her sister had contracted polio at the age of 10. And I'll give some more statistics while you get a chance to read those. One of the things I have a pet peeve about when it comes to PowerPoints is reading what others can read for themselves. So I will not do that. So polio in the US, like I said, was in 1894. In 1916, there was a big outbreak in New York City. There were 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths. In 1946, immediately following World War II, President Harry Truman declared polio a threat to the safety of the United States. In 1952, there were 57,000 cases in the US. Now, if we compare that to our current pandemic, the numbers don't compare. There was about 153 million people, not billion, 153 million people in the US, so about half the population we have now. But still significant. And even though the numbers are small, it's the unknown that was really scary. All of these quotes came from Carolyn Barstead in her memory of when polio hit their household. And parents just had so many questions. Like I said, how did it spread? Where did it come from? So it was mentioned, it's the stories that really help us understand something better. And so I'll share with you a story of Faye Gabrielson, Carolyn Barstead's younger sister. In August of 1955, and this photograph is from a few years later, it was in the junior high newspaper. In August of 1955, that's the first summer the Salk vaccine against polio first became available. Faye came down with flu-like symptoms. She was sick for a few days. She woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and couldn't walk on one of her legs. Her parents, they took her to the hospital that evening here up in Eau Claire, Luther Hospital. She was diagnosed with polio. Her older sister, Carolyn, didn't wake up in the middle of the night. They had some family friends staying with them, and so she slept all the way through the commotion, only to wake up the next morning to her dad coming home, saying that her little sister, Faye, was now hospitalized with polio. And in the interview that was done something like 54 years later, after that night, Carolyn still choked up when she remembered just how awful that morning was, and just because they knew about polio, they knew it did things, they didn't know what. They just didn't know what was going to happen. And so as a 14-year-old, it really just kind of rocked her world, as it did her parents. Carolyn's mother stayed in the hospital with her youngest daughter. just like today, they had to quarantine. So even though the hospital said you need to go home, her mother refused. And so Carolyn's mother, Faye's mother, stayed in the hospital for the next 2 weeks and couldn't see her own family, and her family couldn't see her unless they talked to each other through the threshold. So Faye, a few years later, after she had contracted polio, by the time this middle school or junior high photograph came in, this was her spirit. And you'll hear more of the trial that she had over the course in the next few years. She was highlighted in this newspaper for her sunny spirit. And if you just read this quote, you have to say that, wow, she was quite a kid. So the photo on the right is not Faye. It is another photograph of another child from about the same time period. But the photo on the left, the actual iron lung, that is an artifact in the museum's collection that we did have on display. I pull these up because when Carolyn and her dad went to go see Carolyn's little sister in the hospital, outside Faye's room sat an iron lung. The disease was progressing rapidly enough that medical personnel were not sure what was going to happen, and so they stationed the iron lung outside in case they needed to use it. They saw Carolyn's mother, again, at the hospital room, but they couldn't go see her. They couldn't touch her. They had to talk to her from a distance because of the quarantine. So Faye contracted the disease in early August. She stayed in the hospital until Christmas, came home for a few days, and then went back to the hospital until Easter, just sometime that spring. And all she lost about a year's worth of school. And she'd been planning to go into junior high into 6th grade. She was a young 6th grader, but that had been the plan. That got put on hold. Another thing that happened with the disease, and I don't know the medical terminology or the diagnosis as to exactly how it went through Faye's body, but the muscles in her back were affected uniformly. So her spine got basically out of shape. So she ended up having to have back surgery at about the age of 12. So a couple of years after she was first diagnosed. And what that back surgery meant in the mid-1950s is a full body cast for 6 months, laying flat on her back, and then a half body cast for the next 6 months. So she was basically confined for a year. Faye was 12, and if you recall that quote from earlier, that's after one of those, by that first back surgery. She had a second one later on. And I just think, to be 12 years old and to be confined like that, I mean, people do amazing things when they have to, and she did. So she came home from the hospital both times to this house, which is in Eau Claire, still standing. If you are ever in Eau Claire, it's on Lake Street, right near a Methodist church. They did not build a ramp for her. They let Faye choose how she wanted to live in the house. What they did do for her is put her bedroom downstairs and turned a study into a bathroom so she could navigate around the house as she wanted. And across the street was Faye's junior high that she eventually did go to. That is what the junior high looked like without the turrets by the 1950s. This is an older photograph from Eau Claire. Turrets are a hard thing to keep maintained, so buildings lose them over time. So it was a 3-story building. This was before ADA, long before ADA. It was not equipped with an elevator. And first, school officials wanted to send Faye to a different school in town that was designed for students with physical and learning disabilities. And her parents refused. So no, our kid's gonna be mainstream. Nothing's wrong with her mind. It's only her ability to move around. So she went to the school across the street, and it was her peers, her 7th and 8th grade peers, that helped her navigate the school building. In between classes, if she had to go up a floor, people met her at the floor and carried carried the wheelchair up or down. So that was a lot of trust that Faye had in her friends. Remember, 7th and 8th grade kids. I'm sure you've met in middle school during your time. But that's what they did, and Faye trusted them, and they were her friends, and they knew what had to be done. So the summer of when Faye was diagnosed was also the summer, like I said, that the Salk vaccine first came out. This is a photograph of that vaccine being administered 2 months before Faye got the disease. Just happened there wasn't enough vaccine at that time. This is in Eau Claire. Final photograph, just because I love it. It's a young child being vaccinated, and times have changed, as we can see. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the time to share Faye's story.